Alrighty, I guess let us get started. Okay. Yeah, that's a lot of light on me. That's better. Okay. Alrighty, welcome back to SOS 100. I guess now it's been a week since the class started. So we're already making fast progress. All right, so today I'm going to quickly sort of talk about a couple of things that we talked about yesterday, Monday, in terms of the big schools of sociology that we talked about. And then we are going to delve into some more conflict theory, which is probably going to take the bulk of today, I would guess. Okay, so I guess before I start, no questions so far. Just double check. I feel like there were questions left over last time, and they're just not loading. Something's up here. Hang on, give me something's not working maybe with my question slides, because I remember there being questions last time. And I said I would answer them this time. Maybe something got messed up here. Where am I? Okay. Oh, I see. That's not a Q&A slide. That's different. All right. So let's add one. I'll delete that slide. Whatever it is. There we go. And start from here. Okay. What questions do we have left over from last time? The definition of non-social. I think I did that last time, but non-social basically would be something that's just only relates to the individual, has no social component. Oh, so okay, we're talking about functionalism, right? So this is one of the things that like if we look here, or sorry, here at Talcott Parsons, right? One of the things that I said is that the functionalists, tend to think of institutions as being, functional or dysfunctional, right? They can either be working properly or not working properly. So, I mean, where's that question I was looking at? When I say something's been thrown out of equilibrium, it's going to depend on what institution isn't doing its job, right? So, if say it's something like the police, right? The police, that institution being out of equilibrium, what's not happening there is the proper administration of justice and the defense against, internal threats. If it was something like the family, right? Like if it's the family, then yes. If the family is dysfunctional, then you're probably not getting proper socialization of young people. They're not being taken care of in the way they need to. So it's going to depend on, if it's religion, then values and morals and shared kind of culture aren't being transmitted to people. So it depends on the institution, what's thrown out of equilibrium, and therefore what is thrown out of balance. Okay. Does functionalism uphold ideas like Robert Putnam's bowling alone? Social uncertainty is related to our lack of common modes of association and engagement. Yeah, I think Putnam's analysis is kind of functionalist in its basic understanding. And I think Robert Putnam is pretty famous for writing this book called Bowling Alone, where basically he looked at American society and sort of said, where we used to have these thriving social institutions that kind of allowed people of different backgrounds to mix and interact, increasingly it's become atomized, right? And everybody is kind of in their own little pods, right? So people used to have bowling leagues, and bowling leagues used to be a really big thing where people would go and gather and, be with different, you would bowl against people who were from different social classes, and it would be a kind of community thing. And now increasingly, if people are bowling at all, they're bowling alone, right? Apart from those kinds of big social institutions. So yeah, I mean, I think what Putnam would say, and I think it is a kind of functionalist mode of analysis, is that, the kind of intermediate institutions of society have sort of broken down, right? Things like social clubs, bowling leagues, sports leagues have kind of, and, things like the Lions Club and Kiwanis have kind of fallen apart in their function of gathering people from different classes and different places together and having society mix and get people to know each other and form kind of these strong social bonds. Can I give another example of a manifest function? Okay, so this is, so this is Robert Merton. So I said, I think I said last time schools, the manifest function of schools is to educate people, right? So it's obvious, the thing that it's there for. The police, right? The manifest function of the police is to maintain law and order. The manifest function of the military, right, is to protect from external enemies. I'm trying to think of other ones, other institutions. The manifest function of, let's think. Well, let's say the manifest function of a church, right, or a religious institution would be to communicate religious truths, right? It's whatever the obvious and intended effect of the social structure is, right? The family is to socialize, and care for children, right? These are all the manifest functions, right? So whatever, when you look at a social institution, whatever it's supposed to do, right? The manifest function of the Montreal Canadiens is to disappoint me every single season. That's its obvious and intended function. Okay. So I'll skip to this one for a sec. Are latent functions always negative? No. Latent functions are just unintended, right? So I think I gave the example last class of university. And one of the long-term kind of things that universities used to do, I don't know if it does it as much anymore, was that it provided a place for people to meet people of kind of a similar social class and educational background, right? So universities in large part, certainly for the silent generation, the baby boomers and Gen X, maybe a little less for millennials, was a place where you would meet romantic partners that you would then marry, right? That's not a negative function. It's just not when the university was set up, right? And we thought about, communicating knowledge and educating people, helping them, find romantic partners was not part of that equation. It's sort of, unintended. Now, obviously, there can be really negative unintended consequences of institutions too, right? That one happens to be a somewhat good one, but you can have extremely negative latent functions, right? Like nobody ever set up the police with the idea that they would target particular minority groups, and yet that is, kind of a, anyway. That is kind of a latent function of the police in a lot of cases, right? Is to certainly keep certain groups in their kind of social place, right? And so it doesn't have to be negative, but it can be. Okay, difference between middle range and grand theories. So grand theories, I cleared the wrong one. That's okay. I remember the question. Okay, so grand theories. Grand theories are about, explaining a broad swath of the social world, right? So trying the idea like something like Marxism is trying to explain why society is the way it is on grand terms, right? For Marx, right, it's all about class conflict. Why society is the way it is because there's powerful people and people with less power struggling against each other, and that's what makes a society, right? Or in functionalism, right? The grand theory is you have social institutions, they serve a social function, and either the society's in equilibrium and everything's working well, or you have institutions in dysfunction and then society gets a little bit out of alignment. Middle range theories are more to explain specific phenomena, right? So you might be like, why at the University of Alberta, maybe that's probably not a bad example. I'm making this up as I go. Why at the University of Alberta do people tend to find romantic partners that they then get married to during their undergrad degree, right? That would be you're trying to explain a very specific social phenomenon rather than giving a picture of all of, society. And so you might be like, well, it's because, people of a similar social class come together, And it's as they're entering into adulthood, so they're looking at forming permanent relationships, and that's why the university is a particularly efficient kind of mating market. Okay, so that's a middle range theory. Okay, if you have any other questions, feel free to ask. All right, so we're talking functionalism. I guess I already kind of said a few things here. But yeah, basically, human behavior is governed by stable patterns of social relationships, institutions, or social structures. They either maintain or undermine social stability. If they're all working well, they should maintain it. If they get out of order, they might kind of undermine it. And basically, social structures are based mainly on shared values and preferences or beliefs, right? That society sort of generates social institutions gradually over time based on these shared values. And yeah, I mean, basically when something gets kind of out of whack, you need to reestablish equilibrium, and that's how you fix things. Right, Talcott Parsons, who brought brought functionalism to North America, right, kind of really did the task of like breaking down which institutions kind of do what, right? So they all kind of need to work together for a smooth operation of society. And if one of these institutions gets into dysfunction, right, you're going to generate social problems, right? So they all do their things. Families raise the next generation, right? The military protects against external threats, the police against internal threats. Schools teach knowledge and values, knowledge needed for the workforce, and values needed, especially as societies like Canada and the US get more ethnically and racially diverse, common values that kind of anchor people in a Canadian or American identity. Religion helps people, or basically it provides a shared moral code and way of understanding the world, right? These are all the things that Parson kind of said. Merton, we talked about manifest and latent functions a second ago, so I won't go over it again, but that's where we are. And then we ended off basically on conflict theory, right? So conflict theory, specifically from, sort of has a Marxist basis, right? It starts off with Karl Marx, and it's basically at a kind of grand scale about the idea that every society basically works as a series of conflicts between groups who have power and those who are trying to gain more power, right? And that there's always kind of social conflict going on. The more inequality there is and the greater the imbalances, the more conflict is going to happen in society, right? Okay. Now, sometimes patterns like inequalities can produce social stability, right? If the dominant class is so dominant that no one can challenge them, then you've got a very stable social order. If that breaks down for any reason, and if conflict increases, right, then you can get kind of transformations and revolutions. Okay, and generally, one of the big stresses is that whoever the social elite are, the privileged, right, the powerful, the oppressors, they want to organize society basically in order to maintain their privilege. Now, for conflict theorists, the elimination of privilege should lead to lower levels of conflict and increase welfare, right? And it's, anytime you have a lot of privilege for one group, whether it's economic or political or otherwise, they're going to be on top. They're going to be trying to keep other people down. If you can eliminate it, it should benefit everybody. Okay. So, like I said, this really comes out of the thinking of Karl Marx. And Marx, living as he did in the 19th century, born 1818 and died in 1883, got to live through basically some of the worst parts of the effects of the Industrial Revolution, right? So first in his native Germany, and then once he's exiled from Germany in England, where he lived the rest of his life, Marx basically observes the conditions caused by the transformation of society caused by the Industrial Revolution, right? The big industrial cities, right, where you had masses of the working class working in really poor factory conditions, and then a small kind of elite who owned the means of production and lived, really good, posh lives because they had so much excess capital, right? So basically, Marx looks back at history, and to be perfectly honest, Marx is a lousy historian. But he looks back at history and he makes this kind of declarative statement, which you find in the opening lines of the Communist Manifesto, that all the history of mankind mankind hitherto is the history of class conflict. And he goes back in European history and finds different classes that were in conflict with each other. And he says basically, it kind of history sort of moves in what he calls a dialectic, which he gets from another thinker called Hegel. And basically it's like you get transformations in the means of production, so how you make things, right, causes changes in kind of the social structure, and from that you get a new society, right? So you think you're living through industrialization, right, a huge transformation in the way people made things, which led to new modes of organizing society, right? People moved to cities, people moved out of the kind of villages that they had lived for a long time. And basically, this caused a whole new kind of social organization. People's lives started to be organized around the clock, around clock time instead of, kind of sun time, if you will. And basically, this formed a new society, right, which was industrial society in Europe and then in the United States. And this was a place where you had the bourgeoisie, the oppressors, the owners of the means of production, and the proletariat, right, the working class, who had nothing to trade but their labor. And basically, Marx said, this is just the latest outgrowth of a long history where subordinate classes basically struggle with the ruling classes to try and overthrow them and gain power. All right, I got a cutesy little video here from BBC, sort of explaining Marx. Hopefully, hang on. Just make sure the sound is on. We'll find out in a sec.
Karl Marx on alienation. Karl Marx believed that work, at its best, is what makes us human. It fulfills our species' essence, as he put it. Work allows us to live, to be creative, to flourish. However, the reality in 19th century Europe was that work destroyed workers, particularly those who had nothing to sell but their labor. To the mill and factory owners, a worker was simply an abstract idea with a stomach that needed to be filled. The workers had no choice but to toil long hours for a pitiful wage. What was worse, their labor alienated them. Alienation is a disorienting sense of exclusion and separation. Factory labor, under capitalism, alienated the workers from the product of their labor. They made stuff they couldn't afford to buy, which disappeared to shops in far-off places, to make money for people who paid them next to nothing. The factory production line split jobs into meaningless tasks that made the hours at work tedious, empty and bleak. They became cogs in a gigantic machine. Workers lived for the few hours at home when they could eat, sleep and relax. The rest of the time, they weren't fully alive. This work also alienated them from each other. The only way out of this drudgery, Marx argued, was for the workers to organize and revolt. They needed to seize the means of production, leading to his famous rallying cry, "Workers of the world, unite! You have nothing to lose but your chain."
If you're wondering, yes, that is Russell Brand behind Karl Marx in that video. Okay. Will you be tested on videos you showed in class? Sorry, no, I only laugh because no, I won't test you on the videos. They're just illustrations. I'm not that mean. Okay, some people are, I suppose. Okay, pardon me. So, one of the things that happens with Marx, right? So Marx very famously in, in the Communist Manifesto and in Capital, basically and other places, right? Predicts that the final kind of revolution is coming, right? That basically, the bourgeoisie would oppress the proletariat so much that at a certain point, the proletariat would rebel, right? And they would overthrow the bourgeoisie, seize the means of production, distribute it evenly in society so that all workers got the benefit of the means of production. And this would lead to socialism and then communism, right? Where everybody, and this is why it's the Communist Manifesto, right? Now, this never really happens, right? In isolated places, there are kind of Marxist revolutions that spring up, not necessarily where you would expect them to be, and I'll talk about that in a sec. But as time goes forward a little bit, people start looking at the idea of Karl Marx and kind of critiquing them. And specifically, one of our other kind of founders of kind of sociology as a field is this fellow. His name is Max Weber. And Weber basically, comes at sociology in a bunch of different ways. So we'll see Weber's name attached both to conflict theory and then to symbolic interactionism in a little bit here. But when it comes to conflict theory, basically Weber he's working after Marx died, principally, right? So Marx dies in 1883. Weber is like 19 years old in 1883. And so he's really doing the bulk of his work towards the end of his life in the 20th century. And basically what Weber says about Marx is that, this view of history and this view of how society is organized as simply on class conflict is an incomplete view, right? And the kind of idea that, straight up capitalism was an unreformable system that ultimately oppressed workers so badly that they would overthrow it, Weber kind of thought that was going a little bit too far. And specifically, again, coming a little bit later than Marx, he has some benefit, right? He saw some of the developments of capitalism as the world entered the 20th century. And one of the things that happens is you get the growth of different kinds of classes, right? Even within kind of those who are paid wages, you get a sort of separation into different groups, right? So suddenly you get the emergence of the service sector, right? And specifically here, he means managers, a managerial class, right? Or what you might call white-collar workers, right? As the factory system gets big and complicated, and governments need a lot of kind of officials and bureaucrats to help organize the society, help deal with the changes caused by industrialization, and companies need, middle managers to kind of run their factories, organize their books and all that. There's a kind of middle class of workers that emerges who are still not the owners of the means of production, right? But they also aren't proletarian in the sense that they're earning really low wages for very, very hard work. So you get this kind of middle class that forms with pretty high wages, good status, kind of share in control of the means of production without ownership of it, that kind of mitigates some of the problems. Worker conditions also start to improve, right? As basically factory owners start to realize that, there's more efficiency to be found in better educated workers, right? Machines get more complicated, but you have to pay better educated workers better because they're more valuable, right? So things start to get better, economic conditions improve, workers' working conditions get better as well. And I mean, there's also kind of workers' protests and strikes that cause, governments and companies to allow workers more rights and give more benefits to them. Now, the other thing that Weber says is that there's other things that also cause social change other than just or class conflict, right? And he points specifically to things like, politics and religion as also being important sources of historical change. So things change sometimes because of transformation in the religious landscape. And this I thought it was a video there. It's later. And we'll talk about this when we get to symbolic interactionism. But this is basically encapsulated in a book that Weber writes called The Protestant Ethic and the Spirit of Capitalism, where basically he says that, some of the growth of capitalism in particularly Northern Europe in the early days, right, in the 17th and 18th centuries, was driven principally by religious concerns. Here he means the concerns of a particular Protestant group called Calvinists. And we'll look at a little bit at Protestant ethic and the spirit of capitalism in or probably next class or somewhere in there. But basically he says, religion can be a source of social change too. Politics, right? Specifically looking at England, right? The kind of conflict between the nobles and the king, all in the kind of elites, but one group wanting change for the others. The commons, right? The commoners wanting more power. Also can be a source of social change. And therefore, it's not all just class conflict, right? Sometimes it's about, other concerns than just the means of production. Okay. So the person, again, this is a kind of European school in a lot of ways, right? Marx is certainly working in England. He never really has he's not a university professor. He does most of his work, well, he sits in the British Library or the reading room of the British Museum all the time doing his work. He's funded principally by, his friend Friedrich Engels, who's rich and funds all of his work. Engels is the son of a rich factory owner and spends most of his time financing someone who wants to see basically people like his friend's dad get murdered by the working class. So there's always a bit of an irony there. So basically, kind of similar situation to functionalism, right? It's not until the 20th century when people like C. Wright Mills go over to Germany in this case and study with Weber and people who worked with Weber and then bring that back to North America, that conflict theory really gets introduced. So yeah, I mean, C. Wright Mills, you don't need to worry much about Mills, right? But he's the guy who gave us this idea of the sociological imagination, brings kind of this Marxist conflict theory idea over to North America. It really doesn't go anywhere for a long time, right? There's a very anti-communist kind of streak in the United States in particular, and England and Canada as well. And so there's not really fertile ground for these ideas to kind of spring up until the 1960s, right? And you get the growth of a counterculture movement, right? A broad counterculture movement at the end of the 1960s, coinciding kind of with the end of the really rapid post-war economic growth, coupled with, the women's liberation movement and the growth of feminism, anti-war movement against the war in Vietnam, and labor unrest, right? Lots of kind of workers' protests in the late 1960s as companies try to roll back some of the gains that workers made in the post-war period. And you start to get this conflict theory perspective bubbling up in North America. Okay, so what then happens, though, is kind of a weird story, but a really, really important one, and one that I think continues to have really deep effects today, because the foundations of conflict theory, as you kind of find it in the university today, are laid in the 1960s and 70s in what's called the cultural turn, right? So what basically happens is, in the 1960s, you have, how to put this, a bunch of slightly disillusioned Marxists, right, including some kind of German scholars who came over from Frankfurt during the Second World War, the so-called Frankfurt School. So you got Horkheimer, Adorno, and Marcuse. And basically they're looking at, because they're Marxists, they all kind of believed in the communist revolution, that it was coming, that capitalism would collapse under its own weight. And in the post-war years, they're like, yes, the mighty Soviet Union and communists defeated the German fascists, and it's just a matter of time before the United States and its workers rebel also. And that basically never happens, right? And so these Marxists are left with sort of a quandary, right? They're basically left in this position where it's like, okay, we're 100 years essentially after Marx, and when Marx wrote some of his most influential works. And we're no closer to a communist revolution in places like the United States or Western Europe than we were at any time. And in a lot of ways, it seems like it's getting further away, because in the post-war period, there was an economic boom. Workers' lives got a lot better. And there was a very kind of concerted anti-communist sentiment in a lot of these societies, right? And so they kind of turn and they're like, okay, why did communism fail to take root in all but a few places? And here, you can look at Russia, right, where the Soviet Union appeared. Russia was a barely industrialized society when the 1917 revolution happened. And then China with Mao Zedong, which was basically not an industrial society, right? When Mao took over, it was industrialized after Mao in most ways. There was some industry, but it wasn't an industrial power by any stretch of the imagination. So they do what's called the cultural turn, and they start to look at, amongst other things, how capitalism and capitalist societies have maintained their power, right? How is it that they've convinced these workers that actually capitalism is good for them and that they should just like live through capitalism, right? That they should live in a capitalist system all the time. So they start to look at things like culture and the role that culture plays in maintaining capitalism, which is why it's called the cultural turn. Okay. They draw a lot on this particular fellow. So this is a guy named Antonio Gramsci. So Gramsci was an Italian Marxist in the 1920s and 30s, and he got on the wrong side of Italy's fascist dictator who was later allied with Hitler, Benito Mussolini. And basically, Antonio Gramsci ended up in prison, right, where he wrote what are called the prison notebooks, which is the bulk of the work that we have of his that's of any interest. And what the Marxists of the 1960s and 70s kind of look at is Gramsci's work on how culture plays a role in maintaining the power of the elites, right? And basically what he said is a couple of things, right? That ideas kind of have a sort of life of their, well, not a life of their own. Ideas are a space of contestation in any society, right? Basically, ideas are what govern people's kind of worldview. How you see the world, right, is governed by the ideas that are floating around, right? And basically, at a certain point, what Gramsci says is certain ideas become what he says are hegemonic. Hegemony basically means that it's dominant, right? So that ideas gain a sort of cultural hegemony, right? They control the whole culture. Now, this, he says, is typically the ideas of the upper class, right? The upper class works basically to propagate its ideas through culture in capitalist societies so that everyone accepts it. And you know you've reached cultural hegemony when an idea becomes common sense, right? Where everybody just kind of accepts it without really thinking about it, right? So one of the examples of, sorry, I hear someone whispering over here, and it's really loud up here, like the acoustics here really carry it to me, and it's like constantly bothersome. So if you could not whisper to whoever you're whispering to, that would be great. Or get out. I don't care which. If you want to have a conversation, you could do it outside the class time, right? I'm sure you're bothering the people around you too. Okay, so an example of hegemony, a culturally hegemonic idea, something that's become common sense, would be something like this idea of the American dream, right? The American dream, that no matter where you come from, no matter what your background is, if you apply yourself, get an education, and work hard, you can succeed. You can have the white picket fence, the family, the kids, the dog, the 2 cars in the driveway, and take a nice tropical vacation every winter or every couple of years, right? That this is just how America works, right? No matter who you are, it's just about working hard. That became a sort of, accepted cultural idea, and it's an example of an idea that's become culturally hegemonic, right? And there's lots of these, right? Like that Canada is a mosaic, right? That's an idea that was broadly perpetuated by kind of the government and ruling elites. That Canada is somehow different from the US in that it's a cultural mosaic, and it's so ingrained in people that I think most people don't even question whether it's true or not, right? And so basically what Gramsci says is that these are the kinds of ideas that the ruling class use to dominate a society, right? That they convince the people that this is how the society works. And when they're capitalist, they convince people that capitalism works for the benefit of everyone equally. And therefore, everyone benefits in a capitalist society. Okay, so hopefully that makes sense. Should probably well, if you only get tested from content from the slides, what's the point in me being up here and doing anything other than just flipping through the slides? Yes, definitely some of the things I say in class could be tested on the exam. I won't try to make it super specific, and I am mostly trying to illustrate some of the points and give you deep content. But yeah, if anything I say is also fair game, but I won't make it super obscure. Will you only be tested on information from the slides? the lectures. I'll put it that way. Okay, oops, okay, I skipped a. Okay, so, Foucault. How to explain Michel Foucault? Okay. So Foucault comes about, he sort of makes his appearance on the scene in France in the 1950s. And he takes these kinds of Marxist ideas, and especially about culture and about how culture is the way that people are dominated, right? Essentially to the kind of the next level. And Foucault's thinking remains, Foucault is kind of like a rock star. France is a weird culture, where they really do reverence public intellectuals. And in his lifetime, Foucault was one of the top ones. Like if you'd walked around Paris when he was alive, you would have seen copies of his books like in the front windows of bookshops. Very, very influential, and his influence kind of spread then, to the rest of the world as Foucault's works got translated. Foucault, kind of taking this conflict theory idea, thinks that, everything in society is about a struggle for power, right? That it's all conflict over power, right? Who has power? Who can exercise power? It's constantly being kind of worked and reworked in society, and everybody is trying to get essentially their truth claims, right? What they believe accepted as the true knowledge of the society, right? So every social interaction is power, right? This is a very cynical view, by the way. Every time that you speak to someone, every time that you flirt with someone, every time that you tell someone what you believe, you're trying to exercise your power over them. And so, I should have written this down, but a really good kind of Foucauldian way of thinking about power is that what power is your ability to impose your subjectivity on someone else, right? So, your subjective point of view, your ideas, your beliefs, if you can impose that on other people, that's power in the Foucauldian kind of sense. And he thinks that society is all just this conflict over everybody trying to impose their subjectivity, their beliefs on other people, right? And so this is how Foucault thinks about everything that's happening in society, right? And culture is just one of the massive tools that certain groups in the social elite use to propagate their ideas, right? They propagate it through culture. Okay. I made his face even bigger. He's a scary looking dude. Intense, right? He's got a really intense kind of face. Very striking. So yeah, according to Foucault, right, basically, sometimes you have modern institutions that actually do use violence, right, to regulate behavior. But more often, what they do is try to regulate behavior in non-violent ways, and particularly by what he calls internalization of control mechanisms, right? And I remember my lit theory teacher in my probably second year of my undergrad, put it in a very pithy way, that in this kind of Foucauldian way of thinking about it, the goal is to get you to internalize the means of your own repression, right? So that I no longer, as the social elite, have to deploy the police or the army to oppress you. I can get you through ideas to oppress yourself, right? And that is the goal that's how modern societies increasingly regulate behavior. They make you regulate it yourself, and you are the one who oppresses you, because the structures of that power are so deeply built in your own head that you're the one who actually applies power to yourself, right? Yeah, I don't have the panopticon there. I should have had it. Okay, so the model that he has of this is what's called the panopticon, right? So in a book called Discipline and Power, Foucault writes about this ideal kind of prison, right? Where basically, the way he envisions it is this prison is circular, right? So it's a big circle with cells on the outside, right? And a tower in the middle. Now the windows in the tower are all screened so that if you are in the tower, no one can see you. And the idea that, and Foucault's borrowing this from a guy named Jeremy Bentham, an English philosopher. And he says this is Foucault says that the panopticon is the model of society. So that basically, like, if you're a prisoner in this prison, you would never know if you're being watched by someone in the tower that's at the center of the prison, right? And so what would you kind of logically do? You would assume that you're always potentially being watched. And so instead of them having to have guards that come and keep the rules, you're going to keep the rules yourself, right? You're just going to follow the rules because you're never quite sure when you might be observed. Now, for Foucault, increasingly all of society is like a panopticon, right? With the advent of, I mean, he dies in the 80s, so he couldn't imagine, the world of social media and CCTV cameras. But increasingly, he thinks that we're under surveillance all the time. And because we know that we're under surveillance, we just follow the rules, right? So, I mean, I always give or that you might be under surveillance at any given point. I always give the example of this, I remember, being out with friends one night, really late, coming home at like 3 a.m, and sitting at an intersection where there was a red light. Now, this intersection, completely empty, right? No cars visible in any direction. And I sort of vaguely consider for a moment, should I just run this red light, right? It's 3 a.m, there's nobody here to see me. In Edmonton, everything's legal as long as you don't get caught, at least in theory, right? So that's true of everywhere, by the way. As long as you don't get caught, theoretically, there's no prohibition. And so should I just run this red light? And I just sat there and waited for the light to turn green. And this is a moment of me internalizing the means of my own repression, right? I'm being oppressed by that traffic light, except not really. It's just the thought that, well, what if there's a photo radar camera and I just can't see it? What if there's a police officer that I just, maybe he comes around the corner right as I'm running this red light. I'll get a ticket. I don't want that. So instead of, just running the red light and getting home 10 minutes sooner or 5 minutes sooner or whatever, I just sat there at a red light with nobody else obeying the traffic laws just because the traffic laws are deep inside me, right? I have become one with the traffic laws, if you will. And this is sort of what... My battery is running low. And class is almost done. We should be fine. And if we're not, we will be. If we end early, it's because my battery died. I would get the charger out, but by the time I plug it in, everything will be done. Right, so he thinks this is all how society works, right? That everything is about us internalizing our own repression all the time. Like, we are constantly following rules because we think we might be observed, right? And why? Because those rules have been powerfully kind of instilled in us by the culture, right? So you won't cheat on your exam, right? Why? Because you might get caught, right? Or because you assume that the social order is ultimately a good one, and it's a meritocracy, right? This classroom is a meritocracy, life is a meritocracy, the university is a meritocracy, and it's only, if we don't cheat that we all follow the rules that the meritocracy works, right? So you've instilled the rules. And so instead of taking that comparative advantage by cheating on the exam in SOS 100 and getting an A+, you're like, no, I'm gonna suck it up and get that B, because that's what's right, and I might be observed, and so I'm gonna discipline myself, and also the rules are actually really good. Okay. So, this kind of thinking in kind of Marxism, sometimes you'll get it referred to as cultural Marxism. If you're a Jordan Peterson fan, I'm not. But if you are, right, you'll hear him use that term. Sometimes referred to also as post-structuralism or postmodernism. It's basically a school that emerges from people like Foucault. And it basically said, right, there are no stable social relations. Everything is always just power plays. People kind of trying to impose their power through speech and through ideas and control. And yeah, basically people who don't fit into neat categories that are already part of the culture, rather than being expanded, the definition being expanded to include them, are categorized out of existence by the casual use of language, right? And so, there's also basically this we see this in a particular thinker called Jacques Derrida, and Derrida, amongst other things, says that cultures, especially Western cultures, break everything down into binaries, right? So you basically define people as, say, male or female, right? Man or woman, and anything that doesn't fit that definition, you just define out of existence, right? That language is used to basically perpetuate a particular system of thinking. And so one of the pushbacks against this, right, has been, well, that there is a spectrum of gender. And we'll talk about queer theory probably next time. That actually outside of this binary of man, woman, there's a whole bunch of, a whole spectrum between those two things. But basically what post-structuralists say is that culture basically works to enshrine binaries, simple ways of thinking that kind of constrain people and eliminate other possibilities, right? So there would be like white, black in terms of race. There would be, or white and non-white, I guess would be probably the binary. Male, female, gay, straight, and anything outside of those kinds of binaries gets defined out of existence. So one of the projects of the post-structuralist and postmodernist movements is to break down those kinds of binaries. And again, with the idea of liberating, emancipating people, kind of like Christian Smith said in that quote I showed earlier in the course, liberating people from the constraints of society that's been imposed on them by these plays of power that have been put into language. Okay, I have a rather longish Foucault video. Why don't we, it's like 8 minutes long. Why don't we start with that on Friday? Because I could start it, but I'd have to replay it next time. Anyway, so we'll leave it there. I don't even know if there were questions. There are not. So we'll pick it up there on Friday. Have a good couple of days.